The river moved like hammered silver. Under the August sun, a ribbon of white water threading through sandstone, canyons that had seen 1,000 summers and would see 1,000 more. Along its western bank, cottonwoods whispered in, the thermal drafts rising from the gorge, their shadows stretching long across the gravel where 3 teenagers kicked off their shoes and waded into the shallows. The water ran cold despite the heat, fed by snow melt from peaks still visible to the north, and the stones beneath their feet were smooth as river glass. Marcus Holloway, 17 years old and broad-shouldered from 2 seasons of construction work, was the first to dive under, surfacing 20 feet downstream with a whoop that echoed off the canyon walls. His younger brother Tyler followed, then their cousin Elise, and for an hour they swam and floated and let the current carry them through a landscape unchanged. Since the first peoples walked its shores, the afternoons stretched out in that timeless way summer afternoons do. When you're 17 and the world feels both infinite and immediate, when the cold shock of the water and the heat of the sun on your shoulders are the only things that matter, none of them noticed. When Marcus drifted around the bend past the line of willows where the river narrowed and the current quickened, by the time Tyler called his name, the only answer was the rush of water over stone. The search began within 90 minutes. Tyler sprinted back to the trailhead, where their uncle's truck sat baking in. The son drove to the ranger station 3 miles north, and by 4:30 that afternoon, the first teams were assembling at the Putin site. The county sheriff's department deployed 2 swiftwater rescue units, working downstream in inflatable boats, scanning the eddies and undercuts where a body might catch. K-9 units walked the banks through dusk, handlers calling out coordinates over handheld radios as the dogs worked scent cones through the brush. By nightfall, portable lights illuminated a makeshift command post where topographic maps lay, spread across folding tables, the river's course marked in blue, highlighter, with times and last known positions annotated in the margins. Marcus's parents arrived just after dark, his mother, Catherine, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the shift she'd abandoned mid-round, his father, Robert, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling as he pointed to the map and tried to explain the exact spot where Tyler said he'd last seen his brother surface. The command post hummed with radio chatter and the low voices of searchers coordinating grids, and in the center of all that organized urgency sat the terrible stillness of not knowing. The first 72 hours consumed every available resource. Helicopters swept the canyon from first light, infrared, cameras scanning for heat signatures among the rocks. Dive teams probed the deeper pools where the river slowed, weighted lines dragging the bottom in, careful grids. Volunteers walked every accessible mile of shoreline, calling Marcus's name until their voices went hoarse, checking every log jam and debris field for any sign of fabric or flesh. The river gave up nothing. On the 4th day, a senior search coordinator sat down with Catherine and Robert in a cramped office that smelled of coffee and old paper, and walked them through the statistics of cold water drowning, the way bodies behave in moving water, the seasonal patterns of deposition and recovery. He did not say the word recovery, but they heard it anyway. He explained that in rivers like this one, with its particular combination of flow, rate, and bottom composition, remains could travel significant distances before surfacing, sometimes weeks or months later, sometimes never. Catherine listened with the professional composure she'd developed through 15 years of nursing, asking technical questions about water temperature and decomposition rates, and Robert sat beside her, gripping her hand so hard his knuckles went white. The official search scaled back on day 7. On day 10, it was suspended pending new evidence. Marcus Holloway became a name on a list of unresolved disappearances, a case file in a gray cabinet, a photograph taped to the wall of his bedroom where his mother couldn't bring herself to take it down. But Catherine Holloway was not a woman who accepted silence as an answer. Within a month, she had learned the terminology of river dynamics, studied case files of similar disappearances across 3 states, and began mapping the watershed downstream. With the obsessive attention to detail that had made her an exceptional trauma nurse, she contacted families who'd lost loved ones to the same river system, assembled a network of amateur searchers who walked new sections every weekend, and maintained a database of water levels, seasonal flows, and historical deposition patterns. She learned to read the river's moods, to understand how spring runoff changed the bottom terrain, how debris accumulation shifted from year to year, how the canyon's geology created pockets and channels where objects could lodge for decades. Robert threw himself into advocacy work, testifying before the county commission about the need for improved signage, additional rescue resources, and mandatory life vest policies for commercial outfitters. He spoke at community meetings and river safety workshops, carrying laminated photographs of Marcus and statistics about drowning rates, transforming his grief into a kind of mission. Tyler, 18, now and haunted by the memory of his brother's face disappearing around that bend, enrolled in wilderness emergency medicine courses, and spent his summers working search and rescue volunteer shifts. The family's grief became a kind of engine, driving them forward through seasons that blurred together in a succession of press conferences, vigils, and lonely walks along the riverbank where they'd lost him. They became known in the community as the family who wouldn't stop searching, who wouldn't let go, and some people admired their tenacity, while others whispered that perhaps acceptance would be kinder than this endless vigil. Years passed with the peculiar weight that accumulates when grief becomes chronic rather than acute. Marcus would have turned 20, then 23, then 25. His high school class graduated without him. The construction company where he worked that final summer hired new apprentices who never knew his name. The case file gathered dust in storage, periodically reviewed during slow weeks, when cold case detectives had time to scan old files for anything they might have missed. Catherine kept searching, but the searches became less frequent, more ritualistic. She walked the riverbank on Marcus's birthday, on the anniversary of his disappearance, on holidays when the absence felt most acute. She maintained her database and her network, but the urgent energy of those first months had settled into something more sustainable and more painful, the understanding that this might never resolve, that she might spend the rest of her life in this liminal space between hope and acceptance. Robert's advocacy work expanded beyond their immediate tragedy to encompass broader river safety initiatives, water rescue training programs, and legislative efforts around wilderness recreation regulations. Tyler became a paramedic, then a wilderness EMT instructor, teaching the skills that might have saved his brother to young searchers who would face their own impossible situations in the back country. The family had learned to live with the not knowing, had built their lives around the shape of Marcus's absence, and if the wound never fully healed, at least it had scarred over as enough to allow them to function. And then, 13 years to the month after his disappearance, a photograph surfaced on a social media platform used by long-distance hikers, posted by a woman named Jenna Cortez, who'd been documenting her trek along the Continental Divide Trail. The image showed a small mountain town in southern Colorado, elevation 8,200 feet, population 411. In the background, partially obscured by a pickup truck, stood a man with a dark beard and weathered face, working behind the counter of what appeared to be a general store. Jenner had captioned the photo with a mention of the town's name and a joke about the Bratters' difficulty of finding decent coffee above treeing, but within hours someone in one of the missing persons release communities that Catherine had joined years earlier had cross-referenced the image against databases using facial recognition software, still crude by later standards, but refined enough to flag a possible match. The algorithm assigned an 83% probability that the man in the photograph was Marcus Holay. The notification came through on a Thursday evening while Catherine was preparing dinner. A simple message in a Facebook group she checked sporadically. Now, possible match on Holway case. Colorado needs verification. She clicked through to the image with hands that had gone suddenly cold, zoomed in on the face partially visible through the truck's rear window, and felt something crack open in her chest that she'd kept carefully sealed for 13 years. The beard changed the shape of his jaw, and the sun had carved lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at 17, but the way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head to the left when he was concentrating, the specific configuration of features that a mother knows with cellular certainty. She knew Robert, standing beside her in their kitchen, gripped the counter edge and stared at the image on her phone for a long moment before speaking. When he finally found his voice, it was steady, in the way that meant he was holding everything else down. "We need to be sure," he said, "before we let ourselves believe it." But Catherine was already pulling up maps, calculating drive times, her nursing instincts taking over, with that familiar clarity that came when the body needed action to metabolize shock. She called the volunteer coordinator who'd sent notification, a retired detective named Frank Vasquez, who'd worked the original case and had never quite let it go. Frank confirmed that he'd already reached out to the local sheriff's department in the Colorado town, requesting a welfare check and positive identification. But Catherine knew she couldn't wait for official channels to grind through their protocols. She needed to see for herself, needed to know if the impossible thing the photograph suggested could actually be real. The drive to the town took 11 hours. They left before dawn. Catherine at the wheel for the first shift. Robert navigating through mountain passes that climbed into thin air and stands of aspen turning gold with early autumn. Tyler met them at a truck stop in northern New Mexico, having driven through the night from the search and rescue training course he'd been teaching in Arizona. The three of them continued together, nobody saying much, each wrapped in their own thoughts about what they might find and what it would mean if the man in the photograph really was Marcus. They'd notified the local sheriff's department of their plans, but Catherine had insisted they arrive first, before any official intervention complicated what she still couldn't quite allow herself to name as reunion. The town materialized in late afternoon, a cluster of weathered buildings tucked into a valley where two creeks converged, surrounded by peaks that caught the last sunlight on their western faces. The general store sat on the main street, its paint faded to gray, a wooden sign creaking above the door. Catherine parked across the street. Her hands were shaking. Through the front window, she could see a figure moving behind the counter, stocking shelves with the efficient movements of someone who'd done the same task 1,000 times. And for a moment, the entire world contracted to that single point of possibility. Then Robert opened his door, and they crossed the street together, Tyler a step behind, and pushed through the entrance into a space that smelled of woodsome smoke and coffee, and the particular stillness of mountain air. The man behind the counter looked up from the inventory sheet he'd been marking. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Catherine saw recognition flicker across his face, not surprise, but something deeper and more complicated, as though he'd been waiting for this moment while simultaneously hoping it would never come. He was thinner than Marcus had been, his hands marked with scars she didn't recognize, his face weathered in ways that spoke of years spent outdoors in hard country. But when he spoke, the voice was unmistakable beneath the years that had roughed its edges. "Mom," he said, and the word came out like an exhalation he'd been holding for more than a decade. What followed was not the tearful embrace of television reunions. Catherine moved forward slowly, Robert and Tyler behind her, and Marcus, because it was him, undeniably him, stood very still, as though any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile equilibrium allowed this moment to exist. The store's owner, a woman in her 60 seconds named Sarah Brennan, who'd been watching from the back room, quietly locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. She had known Marcus for 9 years, had given him a job when he'd shown up in town looking half-starved and thoroughly lost, and in all that time he'd never mentioned a family. Now, seeing the way these three people looked at him, seeing the way his carefully constructed composure was crumbling, she understood that the silence he maintained had been built on something more complicated than simple estrangement. They sat in the cramped office behind the counter, surrounded by inventory, ledgers and shipping invoices, and Marcus told them haltingly what had happened on that August afternoon 13 years ago. He'd been pulled under by a current he hadn't seen, dragged through a chute where the river compressed between two house-sized boulders, and emerged a quarter-mile downstream, with his lungs burning and his vision gray at the edges. The impact had disoriented him, and by the time he'd crawled onto a gravel bar and regained enough strength to stand, the sun was setting, and he couldn't orient himself to the landmarks. He remembered he'd started walking upstream, thinking he'd reached the Putin site where Tyler and Elise would be waiting, but the canyon's twists had confused his bearings. Instead of walking toward his family, he'd walked away from them, climbing out of the gorge onto a Forest Service road he didn't recognize. Hypothermic, exhausted, and increasingly disoriented. As darkness fell, he'd followed the road until he reached a hunting camp where 3 men from New Mexico were preparing for elk season. They'd given him dry clothes and hot food and a sleeping bag by their fire and offered to drive him to the nearest town in the morning. But when morning came, Marcus had hesitated, even now, trying to explain it to his parents and brother in that small office behind the general store. He struggled to articulate what had happened in his mind during those hours alone in the canyon. He'd felt something break loose, some fundamental certainty about who he was and where he belonged. The terror of nearly drowning had cracked something open, and in that crack all his 7-year-old anxieties had come flooding through. The pressure of expectations, the path everyone assumed he'd follow, the feeling that he was performing a version of himself that didn't quite fit, the thought of returning to his old life, of walking back into that prescribed future, filled him with a panic as overwhelming as the panic he'd felt underwater. So when the hunters asked if he wanted that ride to town, he told them he'd had a fight with his family and needed a few days to cool off. It was true enough if the fight was the one happening inside his own head. The hunters were kind but incurious, and when Marcus offered to help with their camp work in exchange for letting him stay, they'd agreed without asking too many questions. Days became weeks. The hunters broke camp at the end of September, offered Marcus a ride to Albuquerque, and from there he drifted. He'd known, even in those early weeks, that his family would be searching. He'd seen search helicopters from a distance. While he was still with the hunting, a camp had understood what they meant, but by then he was already trapped by the weight of what he'd done. Every day that passed made the distance back more impossible to cross. How could he explain that he'd survived, that he'd been fine, that he'd simply chosen not to come home? How could he face Tyler, who'd been there when it happened, who'd watched him disappear? How could he walk back into his mother's arms, knowing the pain his silence had caused? So he'd kept moving, working kitchen jobs and construction gigs in places where nobody asked too many questions about a kid with no ID and a story full of holes. He'd learned to lie convincingly, to construct a past that explained his lack of documentation, to navigate the gray spaces where people could exist without leaving much of a trail. Eventually, he'd found his way to this mountain town, started working for Sarah at the store, and built something that resembled a life. He'd gotten a driver's license under his real name 4 years ago, had filed taxes, had existed in the basic infrastructure of official record. Part of him had always known someone might find him. Part of him had wanted to be found. But the shame of what he'd done, of letting his family believe he was dead, of choosing silence over the courage to face what he'd run from, had calcified over the years into something he didn't know how to break through. Catherine listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable in that professional way she could summon when she needed to hold back everything she was actually feeling. Tyler sat rigid in his chair, his jaw working as Marcus explained why he'd let his brother spend 13 years believing he'd failed to save him. Robert's hands were trembling again, the same tremor that had started the night. Marcus disappeared and had never completely gone away. When Marcus finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Then Catherine asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to come home?" Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear everything underneath it. All the years of searching and grieving and refusing to give up. And the question wasn't really about physical geography. It was about whether he wanted to be her son again, whether he could bear to step back into the family he'd abandoned, whether home was even a place that still existed for him. Marcus looked at her, and then at his father, and then at Tyler, and something in his face crumbled. "I don't know if I can," he said. "I don't know if I'm the person you remember. I don't know if that person still exists." "Then we'll figure out who you are now," Robert said, and reached across the space between them to grip his son's shoulder. The touch seemed to break something in Marcus, and for the first time in the conversation, he started to cry. Not the dramatic sobbing of movie moments, but the quiet, exhausted crying of someone who'd been holding something too heavy for too long. Catherine moved, then, crossing the small space to wrap her arms around him, and Robert joined her, and Tyler sat frozen for another moment, before he too stood and put his hand on his brother's back. They stood like that for a long time. Sarah watching from the doorway, with tears running down her face. And if it wasn't the reunion any of them had imagined during all those years of wondering, it was real. And that reality was enough to build on. If you've stayed with us through this journey, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the extraordinary human stories we bring you every week. The logistics of return were more complicated than the decision. Marcus had to be formally identified through DNA comparison, a process that took 3 weeks and required coordination between Colorado authorities and the jurisdiction where he'd originally disappeared. A detective assigned to the case conducted extensive interviews to rule out coercion, fraud, or any criminal involvement in the original disappearance, documenting Marcus's account in meticulous detail. The interviews were exhausting, forcing Marcus to revisit decisions he'd spent years trying not to examine too closely. But the detective was thorough rather than judgmental. And by the end of the process, Marcus had a strange sense of relief at having finally told the full story to someone whose job was to establish facts rather than assign blame. The DNA results came back with a certainty that left no room for doubt. The man living in a mountain town in Colorado under the name Marcus Holloway was indeed Marcus Holloway, missing and presumed drowned 13 years earlier. The media seized on the story within days of the initial report. A local news station got wind of the case from someone in the sheriff's department, and from there it spread through the usual channels: regional television, national cable, news, social media platforms, where the story gained momentum through shares and commentary. Headlines screamed about the miracle survival, the mystery of why he'd stayed away. The family's long vigil finally rewarded. Catherine made the decision to release a brief statement confirming the identification while requesting privacy for the family. But the statement couldn't prevent the storm of coverage that followed. Amateur psychologists offered theories about trauma and dissociation on cable news panels. True crime podcasters devoted episodes to speculation about what had really happened in the canyon and why. Marcus had chosen years of anonymity over reunion with his family. Catherine fielded interview requests from morning shows and documentary producers, declined them all, and focused instead on the harder work of bringing her son back into a world that had moved on without him. Tyler drove back up to Colorado 2 weeks after the initial identification. The reunion between the brothers happened in Sarah's store after closing, with Catherine and Robert stepping outside to give them privacy. What passed between them remained between them, but when they emerged 45 minutes later, Tyler's eyes were red, and Marcus was gripping his brother's forearm in a way that suggested something essential had been said, or forgiven, or simply acknowledged. That night, the four of them had dinner in the small apartment above the store, where Marcus had been living for the past 9 years, eating takeout from the town's only restaurant and speaking carefully around the enormous gaps in their shared history. It wasn't comfortable, and nobody pretended it was. Tyler asked questions about Marcus's life here, about how he'd spent his days, what he'd been thinking, whether he'd ever been happy. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, which meant admitting that happiness wasn't really the right word for what he'd felt, but that he'd found a kind of peace in the simplicity of stocking shelves and ringing up purchases, and existing without the weight of other people's expectations. Tyler absorbed this with visible difficulty, and at one point asked the question Marcus had been dreading, whether he'd ever thought about what his disappearance had done to the brother who'd been swimming beside him that day. Marcus said yes, he'd thought about it constantly. And then he said he was sorry, and Tyler nodded but didn't say it was okay because it wasn't, and they both knew it. The legal complications took longer to resolve. Marcus had been declared legally dead after 7 years, a presumptive finding that had allowed Catherine and Robert to settle his minimalist estate and move forward with certain financial matters. His resurrection, so to speak, required reversing that declaration, a process that involved petitions and court to appearances and the peculiar bureaucratic challenge of proving that a dead man had come back to life. Meanwhile, questions arose about whether Marcus could be held accountable for the costs of the search operation 13 years earlier. The initial search had consumed significant public resources: helicopter, time, personnel hours, specialized equipment, and some county officials argued that there should be financial consequences for what they characterized as fraud or at minimum reckless disregard for the impact of his actions. A pro bono attorney who specialized in unusual civil cases took on the matter, arguing successfully that a 17-year-old in acute psychological distress couldn't be held liable for decisions made in the immediate aftermath of trauma, and that imposing financial penalties would set a dangerous precedent for anyone hesitant to come forward after a prolonged absence. The case was quietly settled, with an agreement that Marcus would participate in public awareness campaigns about wilderness, safety, and the psychological impacts of survival experiences, a resolution that satisfied the county's interest in public good without punishing someone who was, in the attorney's words, as much a victim of the situation as anyone else. Reintegration happened in stages, measured in months rather than weeks. Marcus spent Thanksgiving with his family that first year, sleeping in his old bedroom, where the posters on the walls were artifacts from another century, and the trophies on the shelf belonged to a person he barely recognized. He attended therapy sessions twice a week with a psychologist who specialized in complicated grief and identity reconstruction, working through the layers of shame and fear and dissociation that had kept him hidden for so long. He struggled with the noise and pace of the city where his parents lived, found himself anxious in crowds and overwhelmed by the constant stimulus of urban life, and often retreated to the quiet of the river trails where his disappearance had begun. Catherine walked with him sometimes, neither of them speaking much, just moving through the landscape that had taken him and in a strange way given him back. They didn't talk about forgiveness because Catherine understood intuitively that forgiveness wasn't the right frame. Marcus hadn't wronged her by surviving, even if his survival had come with choices that caused immense pain. He'd been a kid who'd panicked and then gotten trapped by the consequences of that panic, paralyzed by shame and fear, into a silence that grew harder to break with every passing year. By the second year after his return, Marcus had found work with a wilderness therapy program that took at-risk teenagers into the backcountry for extended expeditions designed to build confidence and coping skills. He was good at it, patient with the kids who reminded him of his younger self, skilled at navigating the exact landscapes where he'd once been lost, and brutally honest about the long-term consequences of running from your problems. He spoke at school sometimes, carefully and without melodrama, about how a single moment of panic can compound into years of isolation, about the courage required to ask for help, about the way shame operates in the human psyche to keep us trapped in patterns we know are destructive. The story of his disappearance, in return, became part of the broader conversation about mental health, adolescent development, and the ways people fall through the cracks of systems designed to catch them. Catherine channeled the energy she'd spent searching into advocacy, work for improved wilderness, emergency response protocols, training, programs for search and rescue, volunteers, and support networks for families of missing persons who were living in the same liminal space she'd inhabited for 13 years. The foundation she established in Marcus's name funded research into behavioral patterns in survival situations and provided grants to organizations working on early intervention for at-risk youth, particularly programs that address the kind of existential panic that had driven a 7-year-old boy to choose the unknown over the familiar. Tyler's relationship with Marcus remained complicated in ways that resisted easy resolution. They saw each other regularly, maintained contact, acted like brothers in most of the ways that mattered, but there was a distance between them that hadn't existed before, a careful space neither of them quite knew how to bridge. Tyler had spent his entire adult life shaped by the belief that he'd failed to save his brother, had chosen a career, and built an identity around making sure he never failed like that again. And the revelation that Marcus had been fine all along, that the failure was actually his choice to stay away, had disrupted the fundamental narrative Tyler had constructed about who he was and why. They worked through it in therapy, both in individual and joint, and made progress in the way that progress happens in families dealing with deep wounds, which is to say, slowly and with setbacks, and with the understanding that some things don't fully heal so much as they become integrated into the story you tell about yourself. 3 years after the photograph surfaced, Catherine drove back to the river On an August afternoon, when the light fell exactly as it had the day, Marcus disappeared. She parked at the trailhead, walked down to the gravel bar where her sons had kicked off their shoes 16 years earlier, and stood at the water's edge, watching the current move through its ancient channel. Marcus was alive, working 90 miles north, with the Wilderness Therapy Program, building a life that was different from anything she'd imagined for him, but real and purposeful, and his own. Tyler was married now, working as a paramedic, supervisor, and training the next generation of wilderness rescue specialists, carrying his brother's disappearance in ways that had shaped every aspect of his adult life. Robert had retired early to spend more time with the family they'd rebuilt in the spaces between loss and recovery, and to focus on the foundation work that had become his own form of meaning-making. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was healed. In the way healing gets portrayed in the final moments of redemption narratives, Marcus still struggled with anxiety and bouts of depression. Tyler still wrestled with complicated feelings about the years he'd spent believing he'd failed. Catherine still woke sometimes, in the night, gripped by the memory of those first awful hours when she'd understood that her son was gone. But they were together in the complicated way that families are together, navigating the ordinary difficulties of love and time, and the gulf between who we hope to be and who we actually are. The river moved like hammered silver under the afternoon sun, carrying water that had fallen as snow in distant mountains, flowing toward valleys and plains and eventually to the sea. Catherine stood on the bank where she'd stood so many times during the years of searching, but she wasn't searching anymore. She was simply present, watching the water move, thinking about her son and the strange paths life takes, and the way we're all carried by currents we can't always predict or control. The river had taken Marcus from her in one sense, but it had also been the catalyst that eventually brought him back, however circuitously, however painfully. She thought about the photograph that had surfaced after 13 years, about the algorithmic chance that had connected a hiker's casual social media post to the database Catherine had helped build, about all the contingencies and coincidences that had to align for her to find him. She thought about the thousands of families still searching, still waiting, still living in that terrible space of not knowing, and felt grateful in a way that was inseparable from sorrow for all the others who would never get what she'd gotten. After a while, she turned and walked back to her car, the sound of the river fading behind her as she drove north toward the city, where Marcus would be arriving tomorrow for Sunday dinner, where Tyler and his wife would join them, where Robert would cook too. Much food, the way he always did when the family gathered, where they would sit around the table and talk about ordinary things and extraordinary things, and continue the slow work of building a family that could hold both the weight of what had been lost, and the gift of what had been found. The photograph that had revealed Marcus alive after 13 years sat framed now in their living room, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that mysteries sometimes resolve in ways you can't anticipate, that people can be lost and found and lost and found again in different ways throughout a life, and that the work of loving each other through all of it is the only work that really matters. The river moved on as it always had and always would, carrying its secrets and its stories toward the wider world beyond the canyon. And Catherine drove home through the golden light of late afternoon, at peace in the way that comes not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of purpose.